intro, if we have our big three paradigms, the symbolic interactionist, your structural functionalist, and your conflict, now we're getting to symbolic interactionism. If you remember back to intro, then you probably remember that this is the one that's a little bit different than the others. It's very abstract, it's micro level. It is focused on interactions between people, between groups, and between institutions. So on WooClap, I have this question. When I think symbolic interactionism, the first word that comes to mind is, so I want you to take about a minute, and the first word that comes to mind, just put it into the Woo chat or WooClap. Relationships. Intersectionality. All right. So good. It looks like largely we think connections, communication, relationships, also behaviors, intersections and intersectionality, interactions, gestures, Mead. All right, excellent. So we're not going to start with Mead. We're actually going to start with someone named George Simmel. Simmel starts with an S, sounds like a Z. So George Simmel was an important German social theorist, and he was interested in interaction as well as culture and structure. Take structure again, this is going to be different than our previous approaches to structure. So here we have another, in quotes, most influential sociologist. But differently than our other most influential sociologists, Simmel remains kind of at the margins of academia for his entire career. So why? And we've talked about this tendency to rank publications based on journal or the forum prestige, and that prestige has not necessarily historically represented the best or the most novel, newest work, but instead that it represents the work of the powerful and connected academics at a select few institutions, places like Harvard, in Europe, Oxford, La Sorbonne in France. So Simmel publishes in less legitimate forums, and these forums were publicly available. They weren't what we call paywalled. So if you've ever tried to open an academic article without logging into UGA libraries first, you probably get a nice message when you click full text that says, pay for this article. That's a paywall. Paywalls are supposed to denote prestige. Simmel is not a fan. So he publishes in newspapers and magazines. This was only part of the reason for his marginalization, though. The other reason didn't have very much to do with his work as a theorist at all. So looking at these dates, Simmel lived from 1858 to 1918. Simmel was a Jewish scholar, and he was Jewish during a time when anti-Semitic sentiment was really strong, but also increasing. So leading up to World War II. And especially in Germany, where he was existing. He was also described as looking Jewish, so his Jewish look and his lack of what would be considered academic publications were reason enough to keep him out of tenured academia. So out of this tenured academic position. And he was excluded even as temporary faculty for most of the elite universities. So he ends up eventually getting, in his later career, an academic position, but it's at a smaller, less prestigious college, and it's not a tenured position, meaning if they wanted to let him go, they could let him go. He's seen as dispensable, whereas other academics were not. So again, we see this favoring of white colonialist ideals and the work of white many-lates. So now we start to see the importance of ethnicity and religion in addition to race, kind of building on our previous topics discussion. And Simmel's major focus was the so-called tragedy of culture. But due to his marginalized position within academic society, or specifically sociology, most of Simmel's contribution ends up being conceptual rather than theoretic. So we don't look at Simmel's work as one theory. We're using the theory of the tragedy of culture. Really, we grab random concepts from him and we see them come up in these other theories later, or even on their own. So let's look at some of the concepts from Simmel's work that have become core to the sociological study of culture, society, and the self. Before we do that, though, do I have another question here? I may or may not. No, I don't. Okay, so social interaction. Simmel's focus, differently than our previous structural theorist, was on these micro level interactions, including ones that may seem trivial, so non-important. Simmel used the term association to describe the relationships. Relationships here, though, meaning interactions. So if you have encountered somebody, you have a relational tie. So here, we've largely been working in terms of qualitative and quantitative statistical language. Now we're getting into network language. So instead of talking relationships, we're talking ties. These are conceptually less fruitful. They're very, very simple. So here I have an arrow from association to this arrow linking our two stick figures. They're having a conversation, they have an association. So Simmel claims the forms interactions take rather than their content are what matter for individuals. Simmel makes an important distinction between a form and a type of interaction. Forms are supposed to be patterns imposed upon events, events, actions, and interactions. So here, now we have our same stick people sitting at a table. They're still relationally tied. They still have this association. But now we see this gray square around them. The scenario is that they're eating lunch with a friend. So the square is kind of encapsulating the scenario. And there are certain types or certain forms of interactions that are associated with eating lunch. Things like having a conversation. So you see this speech bubble. Planning a calendar. What does the weather look like? Are you going to sit inside or outside? What are you going to eat? So those are going to be those gray figures. These are your forms. Types are going to be things that are imposed based on the interaction. So here I have a cycle. Say person one has an idea and presents it to person two. So person two hears it, they construct their own idea, but their idea is based off of what the conversation is already about. They're not just starting a new conversation. Right? So here they're thinking about how to fit this idea into the interaction, and then they present their idea to the other person. This person doesn't quite understand, so they raise an objection. So here we see the type of interaction is dictated kind of by the series of interactions. What are the people or the institutions doing? And how can you respond based on what they did? Okay, so we have our same social interaction, but let's look at it in two different contexts now. So I have eating lunch with a friend in a dyad, or eating lunch with friends in a triad. Simmel notes the importance of group size. So he points out that groups radically change in going from a dyad, 2 people, to a triad, 3 people. The idea being that this is going to be exacerbated as you increase the number of people. Here, roles and hierarchy are going to begin to emerge. Here being the triad. They increase with the addition of more people. Simmel also argues that individual freedom grows with group size because smaller groups exert more control over individuals. Larger groups allow people to become less visible and less subject to group control. So here, if we return to our series of figures, we have our same dyadic interaction that we just looked at with a pretty constrained interaction based off this initially presented idea by person 1. It's a little bit more complex and dynamic in our other situation, our triad. So here we have figure 1 is kind of ordering from an apparent waiter. And then you have figure 2 is saying something to figure 3. Figure 3 is listening, but they're also on their phone and having a conversation about apparent love loss with person 1 on the other side of the table. So here, each of these interactions is constrained to the people involved, but there are more people involved, so you can do more things. If person 2 were to try and constrain person 3 to paying attention only to what they're saying, it might not be successful in this situation, where it might be successful if we were in this dyad situation with 2 people. So let's vote. How would you describe the difference between dyadic and triadic interactions in your own words using Simmel's theory in Woo Clap? Are we having issues with Woo Clap? Because I'm seeing 0 people here.
Yeah, for some reason, my Woo Clap keeps not. I have to keep opening the link you send in the chat every time you post a new question.
Okay. Well, I just refreshed it. Let's try this. So if you have the ability to access the Woo Clap question, go ahead and answer it. I'm not going to read these out loud, but again, this is going to allow me to kind of assess where we're at. Okay, so I do want to talk about one of these responses. So that dyadic is face-to-face interaction and triadic is more infant to adult stranger interaction. Not necessarily. So I want you to try and remove specific identities. That's why I include stick people instead of actual pictures here. So thinking really, really abstract. And abstract to the point where when we get to Mead, we'll actually start to question, is this chair a chair and why? So a dyad and a triad, it's not necessarily going to matter who is in the interaction. It's just going to matter how many people are in the interaction. But I'm glad that that was put there because that's important. Okay. And then, so I'm seeing a lot of reference to face-to-face versus virtual. That also is not necessarily going to matter. So here we're thinking just quantity of people. How many people do you have? The setting is going to impact the form, but right now we're not talking about the form, right? So you'll notice the three, the triad, they don't have a square around them. So here, focus on the number of people when we're talking dyad and triad. And then so here, just types. And then form is going to be context. So say there were to be a gray square around this triad, then we could say, well, obviously their interactions, the form is going to differ because there's, a waiter. This is a fancier restaurant with the triad. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to close out this question and move to a new concept. Consciousness. So Simmel argues that humans engage the world through conscious processes. The idea here is that this gives people the freedom to interpret and react to the world in unique ways, while it also means that the products of consciousness easily become reified, real, and they end up constraining action. So here, really starting to get abstract. Here, say we have we're in grad school and we have the thought, I am an imposter, right? That's a product of your consciousness. Say this thought festers, so you start to think about it a lot. It really comes to the forefront of your consciousness. Well, if you're thinking too much about how much of an imposter you are, maybe you're not spending enough time doing your work for your grad school classes. You've constrained your action. Now you maybe are starting to become an imposter. Your grades are dropping. So that's what Simmel means by consciousness. All right. So let's take a vote. Is consciousness the same thing as agency conceptually? So you can say yes, no. You might not remember what agency means, and that's okay. Or it could be absolutely unclear based on the definition of consciousness. Right. So it's looking like overwhelmingly, either we don't remember what agency means or we just don't buy that they're the same thing. And I would say that that's pretty standard for the field. So feel really good about these answers. Here you're reflecting the real field of sociology. Some people would say absolutely yes. People that are social psychologists or symbolic interactionists themselves would say absolutely not. These are distinct concepts. Agency means your ability to act on your own. The reason that it's sometimes equated with consciousness is because the idea behind agency is that you should have some cognition that leads to this agentic action. A lot of people would contest, a lot of sociologists would contest that there's a cognition involved. So the difference for a lot of people here would be that agency involves less of a thought process. It doesn't seem like a process, it seems more instinctual. All right, so we also have distance. Simmel is really, really interested in this concept of distance. And related to this concept of distance is this idea of the stranger. So the social type of the stranger is defined, according to Simmel, by distance, because strangers are neither too close nor too far away from the group to have interactions. But because they're not necessarily close, these interactions could become unusual, right? There's potential for misunderstanding when you introduce social distance. Simmel says that strangers can be more objective in interactions because they lack emotional ties, but people may also feel more comfortable expressing confidences to them, feeling that this will not get back to other people that they know. So here saying actually that people might be more likely to reveal more things in conversation to a stranger than to an intimate. So we can look at this as there are different types of ties. So strangers are not going to be the only social types, but strangeness can be discussed as a form of social interaction, right? So we can have a stranger or we can have a strange, a weird social interaction. That was just against the norm of what I expected to happen. Simmel noted that the things that are valuable to us are typically farther from us. He says that they must be attainable, but attainable with effort. So here you can see that even though we're getting into a much more abstract, different paradigm, we are still writing in Europe. We are still writing in this Western colonial capitalist context. So we're talking about goal attainment. We're talking about achieving meritocracy. So you do see some of these same themes, despite the difference in the theories. Simmel also gives us information about the concept of secrecy. So we need information about people to interact with them. And form interactions take depends on what information people reveal to others, what information people hide from the other, and sometimes how people intentionally lie to mislead others. Secrecy in the context of distance from others creates different types of relationships. So according to Simmel, the reason we have these different types of social ties is because of different degrees of secrecy. We have acquaintances who we know but are fairly secretive with. We don't reveal a lot to them. Friends to whom we reciprocally share some common knowledge with. So sometimes we'll have common interests, sometimes we'll have shared social networks, and marriages where attempts are made to reveal all secrets. I will pause here because remember, Simmel also said that we would be less likely to be secretive with an acquaintance because there's less at stake in that social tie. So there's a little bit of a gap in this theoretical approach, which could be another reason why we see these concepts independently and not one tragedy of culture theory. So in today's world, at the macro level, some forms like science and the economy are going to require more trust and secrecy, while public and political matters are increasingly transparent. You can see here, even though Simmel is not part of the mainstream academic complex, still kind of adhering to the norms. This idea that only scientists should discuss science. So sometimes you'll hear the word lay people, L-A-Y, to describe just normal people, the public. And it's denotes a sort of derogatory context towards the public, saying basically lay people, the public, are not either intelligent enough, educated enough, something about them is not good enough to be able to do this on their own. They need our expertise and only we can do it. We can debate the extent to which that actually is true versus how much this ending up in sociological writing repeatedly was kind of an aim at maintaining the position of science and the position of sociology specifically. So the idea that you don't want your entire career field to disappear. Also note that this was one of the things that Du Bois criticizes white sociologists for doing. And the last thing I'll note is if it seems like all of these things are linked, they are more linked than they might seem. All of these people actually were communicating with each other. So some of those words very well could be aimed directly at Simmel. In the modern world, at the macro level, again, some forms are going to require more trust and secrecy. So then at the micro level, we have the remoteness of our contemporary lives, and that means that we can be more secretive about our private affairs. So basically saying an emphasis on individuality over the collective allows for secrecy. What Simmel is saying is that our ties are becoming less intimate than they were previously. So then through the process of modernization, Simmel notes that objective or collective culture gets bigger, components diversify, and the connections between these components intensify in such a way that it threatens individual culture. This part is a little bit confusing, but what he's saying here is, first off, we don't necessarily have objective knowledge. What we have is collective agreement that something is defined this way. So here, objective as collective. As norms grow, Simmel says that they diversify. We know that this could be the case, but also could not be the case. So this is one of those propositions that did not come to fruition. Then we have this idea of intensification. Remember, we're becoming more individual as a culture. It is becoming the collective norm to emphasize individuality, which Simmel says is going to inherently threaten individual thought. You cannot emphasize individuality to that extent without forcing some sort of conformity, because if individuality becomes a norm, now you have to conform to being an individual. Simmel says this is a tragedy of culture. So that individuality is basically the big tragedy of culture in the modern world. He says that the division of labor is producing culture, which means not only is art quantified, but creators and consumers get segmented. So here, kind of in an ode to Marx, reinforcing that he thinks this idea of alienation probably exists, and that it's probably due to this division of labor. So again, also alluding to Durkheim a little bit. And then Simmel says that no one has complete knowledge and understanding of culture because of this segmentation. So kind of trying to reinforce what he said about secrecy. If no one has complete knowledge and understanding of culture, then you need specialists to explain what you don't know. So again, this could be taken as possibly true, but it could also be taken as an act of self or field preservation, which is often the criticism. So our next theorist is Thorstein Veblen. And he's interested in the conflict between business and industry. Also, the ways in which consumption, so consuming things, creates status. And Veblen observes that the leisure class engages in both conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure. So his theory is the theory of the leisure class. So key propositions of this theory of the leisure class include, first, that the dominant interest of business is money. The focus is not on the interests of the larger community, but rather on the profitability of the organization. Next, that industry has to do with understanding and using mechanized processes of all sorts on a large scale. And an industrial orientation is associated with the people involved in workmanship and production. So basically saying it requires this bureaucratic structure. And then lastly, that consuming goods and leisure are mechanisms to compete for and increase social status. This is the main proposition, and the proposition that we get the name of this theory from, the leisure class. So here, this idea that eliteness provides access to leisure. And it provides access to being able to consume goods, and importantly, goods that are beyond your basic necessities. There's not much else to this theory. It's fairly straightforward. Veblen's not a huge player, but he is a player. So we mention him. Now I want to turn your attention to Woo Clap. And I want you to answer this question: who am I? So provide up to 20 responses describing your identity. They can be one word, they can be a short description, but who are you? Excellent. So we've got a fairly large word cloud here. I have Woo Clap open as a participant on my computer, so it's looking like y'all cannot see the answer the way that I can see the answer. Let's see. All right. So I will go ahead and I'll upload later an image of this word cloud. But the reason that I had you do this in a word cloud is so you can see kind of some overlap. What we've got here is overwhelming overlap on 3, maybe 4 identities. So we have student really, really large in the middle. And then the next closest, we have daughter, friend, and sister, also fairly large, but a little smaller than student in the middle. But then we have various other identities. We have Southerner, we have stubborn, we have food bank employee, we have queer, we have a cis Black woman, we have female pop music connoisseur. We have 19 years old, short, smart, watcher, resilient, cat mom. So this can tell us a few things. First, it can tell us overwhelmingly that we share this identity that's linked with class students. But it can also tell us a couple things. We're a fairly social group. Even if we're not extremely social, we still identify as friends. And then also, we seem to have a group that is predominantly women. Okay. So I will leave that up on WooClap in case you want to keep adding things, because we do not have any further questions. So if you want to keep WooClap open and continue to answer, feel free to do so. If you want to close WooClap and just focus your attention on the PowerPoint, now is a good time to do that as well. Okay, so now we get to George Herbert Mead. Mead gives us social behaviorism. A lot of you answered when you think symbolic interactionism, that Mead comes to mind. Mead is one of the most, if not the most famous American symbolic interactionist. And he's also known for being one of the more abstract end. So later when we get to the K readings, we're going to read Mead. I'm going to assist with that reading. And you'll see it's a little bit tricky to interpret sometimes, but also it starts to get very, very abstract, but at a micro level. So who is Mead? Mead is this central figure in the development of symbolic interactionism. Mead's tenure was at the University of Chicago, but it actually was not with sociology. So it was with the philosophy department. Many of the sociologists falling under the philosophers category due to their inductive approach to theorizing faced similar circumstances. Keep in mind that these people are sociology PhDs, so technically they're still doctors of philosophy. So here you can look at sociologists wanting to distinguish themselves as a certain type of philosopher. But sometimes they're just in the philosophy department. So Mead is not working with the other University of Chicago faculty that we've discussed, at least not directly at this time. So, and importantly, being in the philosophy department was not something that seemed to damage Mead's status as a sociologist. And this was kind of distinct from previous cases, right? So we've talked about what it means to be excluded from elite institutions and sociology departments. And that usually that means that your work is considered less expert, less prestigious. Mead was a social behaviorist, so looking at behavior from a social perspective, as opposed to a biological or cognitive. So external influences on behavior. And Mead is not only interested in stimulus response, but also the ways in which people think before they act. So it's not just what happens, it's the process leading up to what happens. Mead also thinks that behavior starts with the social, then filters through the individual rather than vice versa. And this is really, really different from psychology. So psychology, the idea is that you cognitively generate thought. What Mead says is, no, you socially generate thought through interaction with another person. At its most pure, what this basically says is you don't know anything unless it is attached to a context in interaction with another person or with some space institution. It has to be an interaction. You can't just be existing by yourself and behave. So Mead gives us this concept of the non-sequential act. The act is just a way to think of this process of interaction and defining things. So there's impulse when the actor reacts to some external stimulus and feels the need to act. So, for example, you feel hungry and decide that you probably should do something about that. Next, you have perception when the actor searches for and reacts to stimuli using their senses. So things like hearing, smell, taste, touch. And the actor decides what is and is not important, and therefore what does or does not require a response. So maybe you're not just experiencing hunger, but also for some reason you're feeling worried. So you make this decision to focus on the hunger because that can be immediately satisfied. Then there's manipulation, when the actor manipulates the object once it's been received using minds and thumbs. So here the idea is that the act is distinct to humans. So an example of this would be picking plants in the wild and then deciding whether you're going to eat them to satisfy a sense of hunger. And then we have consummation. This is when the actor takes some action that satisfies the original impulse. So if the impulse is hunger, consummation would be the point of eating. Now remember, these are non-sequential, so these are not necessarily going to go in order 1, 2, 3, 4, according to Mead. Any questions up to this point on Mead? The manipulation step. So manipulation is when you manipulate some object. The object can be physical. So say I'm using this computer mouse to navigate WooClap. That would be manipulation. But it can also be more abstract. So making a decision, right? So the example is picking plants in the wild, and then you make this decision whether you want to eat them. So you're manipulating the plants, but then you're also kind of manipulating this cognitive space. Any other questions? All right. So now we get to gestures and symbols. Obviously, I have a bear waving hello here, but keep in mind that this was supposed to be specific to humans, but bears can make us smile and they can be really cute when they're far away. So both humans and animals can engage in acts and gestures. Humans can only engage in manipulation because it requires things specific to humans like minds and thumbs. We can start to see a gap in the theory here. Mead wants to make this theory that is both specific and not specific to human animals. So that's the other reason for this bear. A gesture is the basic part of social acts between two or more people. So something as simple as a wave, a glance. Mead says that only people use significant gestures, language, and significant symbols. Biological science suggests that to some degree this is not true. Animals, a lot of them have pretty distinct patterns of communication, especially for mating. And a lot of those things involve gestures that absolutely have a specific meaning attached to them. They are to attract a mate, and the mate is supposed to know this. Mead says that gestures can become significant symbols when they elicit similar responses in both those making them and those observing them, thereby requiring thinking and thus making symbolic interaction possible. So, symbolic interactionist comes from this idea of using symbols and gestures to interact. Importantly, if this proposition were to be true, this idea that gestures can only become significant if they elicit similar responses in the sender and the receiver. What this means is that, say this bear was a human, and this human was waving at us. That if we have a cultural misunderstanding or we don't recognize this wave as a hello, then it doesn't have a meaning at all. Not that it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a meaning because there's no agreed upon thing with this interaction, and it's not significant. This gets a little bit tricky because we have things like norms. There are things that we learn through socialization processes that allow us to recognize both sender and receiver of a wave that we're saying hello. And what Mead says is that this happens in every single interaction. So basically saying that previous socialization may not matter. Here getting extremely abstract. Mead also says that the mind is a social process where people have conversations with themselves to solve problems. So the mind is not a thing, it's a process. Distinct from the mind is the self. And the self is a process unfolding and developing as people can understand themselves as both subjects and objects. And this often entails a process at looking at the self through a social lens. Reflexivity is our ability to put ourselves in the place of others. And Mead says that it's crucial to this process of viewing the self through a social lens. In one of our later units, we'll talk about a theorist, Cooley, Cooley, who provides us with a broader term to encapsulate this process. Cooley calls this the looking glass self. A looking glass is just another word for a mirror. So here you have a small orange kitten, and they see themselves as they think others see them as a lion. So here it doesn't matter what the kitten thinks on an individual level. It only matters what they think other people think. So here that thought is not independent at all, that it is completely reflexive. And then Mead looked at how the self comes about through socialization and growth in childhood. So that you make determinations about what you think other people see you as, and therefore what you are, through socialization in childhood. Gender socialization is one of the more obvious and straightforward processes that we can observe, at least here in the US. Gender socialization starts even before birth, sometimes with these gender reveal parties, where we attach a gender to not even chromosomal sex, but really genitalia. And we say that people that have a penis, well, they're a boy, and people with a vagina are a girl. And then we attach behaviors to being a boy and being a girl. And we teach these things to children, and we teach them that they are these things. And we know that socialization is extremely strong, but we also know that it's a process of socialization because gender is not necessarily attached to genitalia. If you're cisgender, sure. But being a boy and being a girl, being a man, being a woman, those things don't technically have anything to do with anatomy. So then we start to see another gap in this theory, because the idea here is that you don't have a self independent of what others think of you. But with gender, we see that that's not true. There is pushback if somebody identifies you as a little girl and you identify as a little boy. If you're a boy, you're a boy. So this is what I mean by abstract. This idea that nothing exists outside of this moment in this interaction, how we make it and define it. All right. So in childhood, Mead says there are two stages, the play stage and the game stage. And these are stages of the socialization process. So this is how children learn to practice themselves. So in the play stage, children can imagine themselves in the discrete roles of others. Discrete meaning specific. So here, we have images of children imitating their specific parents, right? So they can imagine themselves as others, but only specific others. So the specific people in their lives right now, mom and dad. Then in the game stage, this later stage, children can imagine themselves in the roles of multiple others during a complete interaction. So over here, we have children at school, right? Children manipulating objects in ways that could fashion identity. So here, these children could be taking on the self of a scientist, a generalized other. So this game stage creates an understanding of an abstract, generalized other, right? Not my mom specifically. Say mom's a scientist, not this scientist, scientists generally. This generalized other embodies the attitudes of the community that people use to subjectively evaluate themselves as an object. Basically saying that this generalized other is based on the generalized others that are available and observable. Meaning, do you see people that look like you doing this thing? If you do, then you can take on the role of the generalized other. If you can only identify specific cases, you haven't got this generalized other. All right, questions about Mead up until now? Okay. So then we get to the self. The self obviously is pretty important because our Flipgrid prompt is dealing with the self. According to the Mead, the self, remember, it's a process, not a thing. It conforms and is an individual. So it's a dual process. The I is the active and creative part of the self. Here we have the I wearing pink fluffy feathers and some sunglasses. And the I largely acts against the me, which is the socially conscious part of the self that is presented to others. Here you have the me dressed in all black, just a plain collared shirt and jacket, and staring with a look of disgust or maybe confusion at the I. So here the I is going to be the individual part of the self, while the me is going to be the conforming part of the self. So when you're forming your response, when you're creating your op-ed, are we obsessed with the self? What is the importance of the self? You might also talk about how the conceptualization of the self differs per Mead and per maybe popular society in 2021. So we have things like self-care. Self-care, caring for the self doesn't necessarily fit in with this idea of the self as a process of conformity and individuality. But then to some degree it does, because maybe self-care involves fostering the I because you've been practicing too much of the me. And you might also talk about this idea of the self indicating individuality, an emphasis here on individualism. And how did we get here, or what does that mean, given that for me, that was never the case? Okay. Any? We have two more theorists in this area. The first one is Jürgen Habermas. So Habermas is actually still alive. He's about 91 years old, and he fused Marxism with critical and other theories. So basically, we're taking a interactionist or a micro level approach to Marxism. He uses the concept of the life world which is an everyday world or a realm of common sense. But his interest is not in the life world just as a concept. He's interested specifically in how the life world serves as a realm for daily communication. So here, the space for interaction. Habermas also conceptualizes a system which originates in the life world, but which then comes to develop its own structure. For instance, systems include families, legal systems, the state, and so on. So here, we talked a little bit with Merton about the importance of levels, like conceptual levels of measurement, so that an individual is distinct from a group, which is distinct from maybe a formal organization, and so on and so forth. So Habermas is saying, yes, I think that this is a thing. And interaction is going to occur differently depending on which system the interaction is occurring in and who's there. These structures grow distant and self-sufficient, and then they become separated or decoupled from the life world. What this means is, even though these things are still part of our world, we become so focused on the system at hand that the larger scheme of things doesn't matter in that moment. So Habermas calls this colonization. He says they colonize the life world, and that this limits individuals' ability to argue and achieve consensus. So here, thinking colonization of the life world as the emergence of these colonies, smaller systems. And for Habermas, this is a distinctly negative thing. But he says there's a solution. The solution of the system taking over this life world, the colonization of the life world, Habermas says is the full rationalization of both their recoupling in such a way that each can enhance the other in rational argumentation. So here, colonization is this decoupling. What he says is you want to get rid of that and bring everything back together and start to look at these interactions in a more holistic way. Habermas also believes that free speech and communication are essential to democracy. So talking about democracy, again, I'll note here we're talking specifically about this Western capitalist society. Habermas says there's a form of ideal speech. And he says that this ideal speech situation is one that is free of distortions of power and other corrupting influences, where the best argument wins out. So here the idea is that in an ideal speech situation, the favoring of speech would be entirely merit-based, and it wouldn't be based on power. Stigmatizing attributes would not come into play. If this ideal speech situation occurs, then you can have this contesting of ideas or debate And Habermas says that this should lead to consensus or agreement. So this seems like we're approaching a theoretical gap. But Habermas also fills this gap by saying that undistorted speech is hard to come by in contemporary society. So saying essentially this ideal speech situation may not actually exist. And then we have Anthony Giddens, who is also still living, a little bit younger than Habermas. And Giddens argues that modernity entails an increasing amount of risk. This argument is called the juggernaut of modernity. So a juggernaut is a huge force that kind of takes over everything in its pathway. It's destructive and it's powerful. So Giddens views modernity as this metaphorical juggernaut, this metaphorical, big, powerful, destructive thing. He says that it's capable of bringing rewards, but also great dangers, risk. And even though this juggernaut is controlled by people, it's largely out of their control. And pieces have grown quite distant in time and space, which Giddens called distanciation. So here basically saying that this thing is so powerful that we have lost control of certain pieces. These pieces are going to be our institutions. We know this because people need to trust the systems and the experts who operate these distant systems, according to Giddens. So this is kind of the product of modernity. We can look at again as the division of labor, but instead we're calling it distanciation. And this causes problems because people must have the utmost trust in expertise, whether it's been proven or not. Giddens points this out because people don't trust experts. And he says that this leads to a great deal of social uneasiness. So that's one great risk, is this distanciation, the need for expertise. Then we have technology. Technology creates opportunities and risks. Giddens points out that through distanciation, the risk also increases. So here getting a little bit more specific with the example, applying distanciation to a particular context, technology. Here, the idea is that technology causes this separation, this social distance between institutions and people. Then Giddens makes 4 points about why insecurity and risks exist. He identifies design faults. So those who are designing the juggernaut make mistakes. Human error. Operant error. So those who operate the juggernaut make mistakes. So we talk about, in theory, this should work, but in reality, it doesn't always go as planned. unintended consequences. So we can't foresee all of the consequences of modifying or creating new components for the juggernaut. So basically saying that technology has consequences that we don't even know about yet. We're starting to see some of those consequences now in the 2020s. And then the last reason is the use of new knowledge. So people reflect on the juggernaut and create new knowledge about it, but it's hard to tell how this knowledge will affect the juggernaut. So here basically saying that theory does not operate in a vacuum. It is not just that we are theorizing and testing theory and then nothing happens. What Giddens is saying is change happens as a result of the theories that we make. It's unclear how, it's unclear maybe when or why, but for some reason, this use of new knowledge is going to impact the juggernaut. So just to review, the juggernaut of modernity is controlled by the people. It is grown in time and space, so now people have lost control. The loss of control means that people must trust systems and experts. People do not trust experts, which leads to uneasiness. Distanciation increases risk, compounding the risk created by technology. And then technology creates opportunities and risks on its own. And then again, why are people uneasy and why do these risks exist? Faulty design. So let's use AI as a hands-on example here. When AI was introduced, there was this unfounded assumption that it was unbiased. So there's an inherent design fault in AI. Then we also have operant error. So we have the potential to misuse, either intentionally or unintentionally, AI. So Facebook kind of losing control of their AI and getting in a lot of trouble was due to operant error, right? They made some mistakes. Because of those mistakes, there are unintended consequences. In Mark Zuckerberg's testimony to Congress, he disclaims that nobody could have foreseen this happening, and he's trying to fix it now. There's pretty strong consensus that maybe he couldn't have seen this happening. But then there's also an understanding that at some point there was an understanding. So there are unintended consequences. Then the use of new knowledge. Here, people start to use Facebook. It starts to take on a life of its own. Your Facebook profile becomes representative of you. It's personified. We didn't see these unintended consequences. It was unclear how this new theorizing about them would impact them. But we know, for example, that we have studies saying that there's an association between Facebook use and depression. And we know that this association has become stronger with time. But it's unclear the extent to which that initial research saying there's a link between social media use, looking at Facebook, and depression influenced these later thoughts. So here is self-fulfilling prophecy. It biases what people think about how Facebook will impact people, which could lead to it impacting people in that way.